Good evening. My name is Noam and I'm from Moreshet. I am pleased to open the second series of the webinars, Polish Talk Mondays with JHI, Jewish Historical Institute. This special program is a cooperation between Moreshet, Mordechai Anielewicz Memorial Education and Research Center, the Polish Institute in Tel Aviv, the Association of Israeli Guides and Leaders of Delegations to Poland and Commemoration of the Holocaust, and the Emanuel Ringelblum Jewish Historical Institute. This evening, we are hosting Dr. Bartosz Borys, who will speak about how can we use the topography of Warsaw in education about the Jewish past. We will have approximately 45 minutes of presentation and then approximately 15 minutes for questions. When we get to the question session, please submit your questions via the Q&A button and on your screen and not via chat. Dr. Bartosz Borys is a historian, graduate of the University of Wrocław, head of education department at the Jewish Historical Institute in Warsaw, interested in the history of Warsaw Ghetto, the Oneg Shabbos group, the underground archive of Warsaw Ghetto, intellectual resistance of Polish Jews during World War II, Jewish sport in interwar Poland, using the interpretation of the heritage methodology in education. Dr. Borys, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Noam, and hello, everybody. I'm happy that I can be here on this event that we share with Moreshet again. The last time I was on the lecture in January this year. So just let me turn on the presentation. So, okay, as a Jewish Historical Institute and the Education Department, using the topography of Warsaw is something quite natural and normal for education purposes. Of course, in the main picture, you can see the headquarters of the Jewish Historical Institute in Warsaw, and we have exhibitions and plenty of events that we can use for the educational purposes. But in general, the topography of the capital city of Warsaw is great if you want to use it for the education purpose for people. In our case, it's mostly the Warsawians, the students from Warsaw schools, but as well as foreigners who visit Warsaw. And I can imagine that the perspective of Warsaw people or Poles could be different than the perspective of foreigners. And I'll be presenting 13 locations on the former Jewish Warsaw. And I would like to tell you about how we can use them to describe not only what was here and what's here right now, but what else, what would be the deeper meaning of that building or commemoration, what discussion about some certain topic from the Jewish past we can start being there. So I prepared a couple of questions that I think all of them or most of them we can ask ourselves when we are in one of those locations or when we see those pictures. I'm not gonna repeat them in each case. It's just like for you and for myself for a start. So always we can ask what was here before the war and what we can see right now, but also what's even the more interesting, we can use certain location to discuss what does this place tell us about the Jewish past. And sometimes there are like few layers of what knowledge does this place bring us. Sometimes it's just like, oh, here was this institution or that, but sometimes, it could be a place to start a deeper discussion. Like one of the locations is the former Femina Theater that exists in the Warsaw Ghetto. So it could be a place to start discussion. How was the artistic life in Warsaw Ghetto and what did that mean to the inhabitants of the ghetto? And what would be also interesting is how the past is commemorated here in this particular location, who lived there back then and who lives here now, and why, and what did that mean to live in the former Warsaw Ghetto just after the war, and what does that mean right now? And also what would be very interesting is what was the dynamics of commemorations related to the Jewish past in Warsaw after the war. So I will present my perspective and will be happy to listen to your questions in the Q&A after the lecture. And of course I have to start with a few words about Warsaw after the war. Well, of course, Warsaw was destroyed completely, and these days the city is completely different than it was before 1939, and there were a few aspects of Warsaw being ruined by the Germans. Firstly, September 1939, the siege of Warsaw, later on Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, Warsaw Uprising, and post-uprising destruction of the city until 17th of January 1945 and the entrance of the Soviet army. So former pre-war Jewish district, which was northern part of the city, that later became a Warsaw Ghetto, became pile of ruins. And also most of the Warsaw and Polish Jews perished during the war. Most of the buildings were ruined. So this area that was before the war part of the city that we called Northern or Jewish district doesn't exist anymore. And what was built on the part of the former ghetto is a place that you probably know or heard of, Muranov district, that took almost 20 years after the war to construct completely new neighborhood of the ruins of the former ghetto. But in many places, even though almost nothing exists anymore, we could find traces of the past, and it's somehow up to us and our knowledge what those places tell us about that past, and how we try to guide people through this area. What is very inspiring for us in the education department at the GHI is the heritage interpretation by Freeman Tilden, which became a key to us when we try to explain the Jewish past for our guests. Just a few words about the Freeman Tilden. He was an American writer and employee of the US National Park Service who created the principles of a theory of interpretation of heritage. And those principles are universal and could be adopted to the heritage interpretations all around the world, including Warsaw and its Jewish heritage. And there are a few principles that I wanted to mention that somehow lead us when we prepare our guided tours through the former Jewish Warsaw. Well, first of all, its interpretation has to meet personal experience. It's worth to know that interpretation, it's not information, but a revelation based upon information. And interpretation is an art which combines architecture, photography, and literature. And the aim of interpretation is not teaching, but provocating for thinking and rethinking. And this interpretation somehow should aim the whole human experience. And the map. I chose 13 locations, and on the first slide on the left, you can see the limits that probably you've seen in many maps or pictures, the limits of the former Warsaw Ghetto, the widest limits, because we know that the limits changed many times. So this is like the first and the widest limits of Warsaw Ghetto with 13 locations on the current map of Warsaw. And so this is, let's say, it's not really a circle, but we start and we end in the same location because those 13 spots are most common on our paths when you walk through Warsaw. And I can imagine that many of you, when you've been to Warsaw, you've been to those places. And I'm simply curious if what I'm gonna tell about those locations somehow meets what you heard or thought being there. So let's start from current Żych headquarters, former Tłumackie Square. One of the pre-war centers of the Jewish life in Warsaw, with the great synagogue and the main Judaic library. Now it's completely different. On the left, there's still a building of the former Judaic library, which became a headquarters of the Jewish Historical Institute. And on the right, we have Blue Tower, built on the ruins of the synagogue. And what does it tell us about the Jewish past? Well, first of all, it's about occupation. The building of the former library, and now Żych, was a headquarters of the Jewish self-aid. So this is an example of civil resistance in the hopeless times of German occupation. Well, those who worked there, Jews, were helping the other Jews by providing what was the most needed in this basic level, like food in the chains of public kitchen, but also organized a lot of cultural events, music concerts, and plays. And the institution became also a cover, kind of umbrella for the group known as Yonek Shabbat, those who documented life of Jews from the Jewish perspective, because their meetings took place in this very location. But this building and this square also is a great example of huge diversity of the Jewish community of Warsaw before the war in many dimensions, in terms of religion, language, economic situation, or the beliefs what would be the future of Jewish nation. And well, how the past was commemorated here. First of all, the institute, the Emanuel Ringelblum Jewish Historical Institute, now the only building with the address at Tłomackie Street, is a state culture institution, and its mission is to spread the knowledge about the history, culture, religion of the Polish Jews, preserve and publish its heritage, and educate both youth and adults about it. And the permanent exhibition, what we've been unable to shout out to the world, commemorates the people, members of the Onek Shabbat, as an example of intellectual and civil resistance that created one of the most important collections of the documents about the Holocaust. So I would say this is not like commemoration of the Holocaust. It's commemoration of the people who chose to act and who chose intellectual and civil resistance as possible for them way of the resistance. And what's interesting is worth to remember that it was one of very important but centers of the Jewish life before the war, but it wasn't similar to the most of Warsaw Jewish community, because the synagogue of Tłomackie was progressive one, and it wasn't the most common faction of Judaism back then in Poland. That would be the Orthodox. And the issue, on the bottom left corner, you see the March of 1947, the 4th anniversary of Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, and you see the ruins on the right side, the ruins of the former synagogue. And, there was this question after the war, if most of the Warsaw Jews and the Polish Jews perished during the Holocaust, what should be rebuilt and for whom? So that was this changing thing, and synagogue obviously wasn't rebuilt, but what was renovated was the current headquarters of the Jewish Historical Institute, with the financial support of Joint from the United States, that was renovated and became a headquarters of Żych in 1947. And what was the dynamics of commemoration? Just after the war, the building of Żych itself and the main exhibition was devoted mostly to the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, and of course, this historical narrative in late 40s that would explain like the Polish Communist Party was inspiring this resistance against Germans inside the ghetto. Only in the 21st century, the existence of the pre-war library was commemorated on the front, on the facade of Żych. And in 2009, Emanuel Ringelblum became a patron of the Jewish Historical Institute. And the only commemoration of the former synagogue is a small plaque that's put on the wall of the Blue Tower. And the other building that it's not known very much, that you can see on the left, is a former Leszno 18, the building that doesn't exist anymore. That was the apartment where, in one of the floors, Emanuel Ringelblum and his family lived. And this building is very important for us because this is where the founding meeting of the Onek Shabbat group took place in fall of 1940. And now we can see the post-war building at Muranów district. And on the right, we have a pre-war building of the Protestant church that existed here before the war. And somehow it was excluded from the ghetto, even though it was in the heart of it. And what we can say about the Jewish past here? Well, for us, the Emanuel Ringelblum as a historian it's very important because he, as a historian, he believed that the Jewish people should document their history by themselves. In 20s, he wrote a PhD thesis at the Warsaw University about the earliest history of Warsaw Jewry, and then he realized that most of the sources were prepared by Christians, not by Jews. And when the war started in September 1939, he was afraid that the German perspective would dominate the narrative about the Jewish situation during the war. And he's an example of a person who believed that Jews has to document their past and presence, to not let the others to do instead of them. And important moment that would explain somehow related with that was in May 1942. That's the moment when the Germans have filmed the propaganda movie in Warsaw Ghetto. And these days, if we only had that kind of source, our view on the history of the Jews would be deformed and manipulated. That is what some inhabitants in the ghetto, like Ringelblum, knew, and this is why he and his co-workers wanted to document holistically everything that happened to do and with Polish Jews during the war. But these days, as the building doesn't exist, this place isn't anyhow commemorated visibly in space. So except our walking tours, I would say the maps that we publish at the Jewish Historical Institute are the best to find this place on the map. What about the street? The Leszno Street, that on this part changed the name into Solidarity Avenue, was inhabited by many Jews already before the war, but during the war, it became one of the main streets of Warsaw Ghetto. And some, like Stanisław Różycki, who also worked with Dionek Szabat, wrote that this street somehow reflects, because of its importance, the Marszałkowska Street, one of the most important streets in Warsaw that was located outside of the ghetto. But except this church, there are very few buildings by the street that somehow survived the war. And obviously, inhabitants who live in this now Solidarity and former Leszno are completely new and moved here after the war. And there's only a very short passage of former Leszno that kept this name until today. The next location I already mentioned today is former Leszno 35 and the Femina Theater. On the left side, you can see a picture from 1949. This is already a new building in which supposed to be a cinema downstairs that was never opened before the war. And then at some point became a headquarters of the theater. And as the building survived, there was also a theater after the war and the cinema, and that was transformed into the shop Biedronka a few years ago. And this is interesting. I mean, this building somehow brings the interesting aspect of the Warsaw Ghetto history, because in the mid-1941, the 5 theaters started to operate in the Warsaw Ghetto following the Germans' allowance. And Femina was one of them. And artistic activity in the ghetto had at least 2 dimensions. On the one hand, there were actors, singers, directors, and other people somehow related with the artistic life before the war that they did not have chance to work in their professions since the war started. And thanks to the opening of the theaters, they were able to earn a small amount of money and do something they enjoy. And on the other hand, visiting the theater was a chance for the audience to forget, at least for a moment, about the difficult living conditions in the ghetto. And the ticket price was relatively small if you compare it with the food prices. Interesting thing is that the attitude towards the artistic life inside the Warsaw Ghetto was completely different outside, on so-called Aryan side, because Polish underground state criticized those who were somehow doing career during the German occupation, because outside the ghetto, legal work for actors was possible only after the registration to the occupants' authorities, and the occupants were able to participate in such shows. And that wasn't the case inside the ghetto, because all of the artists, but also the audience, were Jews. On the right bottom side of the slide, you can see a commemoration that is put inside the building, even though there is no theater and the cinema anymore. By the entrance of the store, you can see a plaque from 1991 that was one of many that they were unveiled in late 80s and early 90s that commemorates on the streets of Warsaw many events from the past. And this plaque commemorates those Jewish artists who perished in the Warsaw Ghetto, or in general during the war. Of course, the question who lived here back then and who lives right now, it's almost the same in all of the slides, because the inhabitants of the buildings, maybe with a few exceptions, are completely new. And those few surviving buildings were like kind of, islands on the ocean of rubble after the war. And only 20 years after the war, this whole area of former Leszno looked like a normal, complete neighborhood. And this is like central part of Warsaw these days. And mostly only those small commemorations led us to get to know what happened and what was located here and there before the war. Another building that somehow survived, even though it was never part of the Warsaw Ghetto, though it was located in the heart of it. It was the building of the courts that was built just before the war. And as the building was modern and useful, the Germans excluded it from the ghetto, even though it was located in the heart of it. And also it survived the war, so now it looks almost the same as before, at least the facade. Entrance to the building was legal to the ghetto residents who were able to make payments in the tax office inside. And some of them used the building as well as a place to meet with families, friends, but also business partners. And the court building was also used for some people as an exit from the ghetto, mostly by those who wanted to pretend outside the ghetto that they are Poles of non-Jewish origin. And these people had to meet several conditions: fake documents, non-Jewish look, contacts with Poles outside the ghetto, knowledge of the Polish language, culture, Catholicism. Others could escape the ghetto in other way and hide in somebody's apartment or shelter, such as Emanuel Ringelblum and his family did in 1943. But not everybody who escaped the ghetto that way stayed on the Aryan side for a long time. Some of the people had difficulties with such kind of life, and they came back to the ghetto where they were able to be Jewish with their friends and family. One of the scientists, Joanna Nowajko-Kulikow, who somehow cooperates with Jewish Historical Institute, she published a book that the Polish title, if you translate it, is the Strategies of Survival. So where she analyzes the ways how people from the ghetto try to escape the ghetto, and the court building appears in those stories quite often. The other location that would be one of the most famous is the bridge over Chłodna Street. Of course, the bridge doesn't exist anymore. It existed just for several months. But anyway, before the war, it was an intersection of Chłodna and Żelazna Street, like cold and iron streets. And now there's the same, that there just isn't a tram line that goes on over the Chłodna Street. And when you remember on one of the first slides, how was the map of Warsaw Ghetto? So more or less the ghetto was divided by Chłodna Street, and that the street was important east-west communication route for the Germans. And firstly, to walk between the two ghetto parts, if you wanted to do that, it was necessary to wait until the gate was opened by the Germans a few times per day. And only in January 1942, the bridge over the street was constructed by the German order and at the expense of the Judenrat, the Jewish council in the Warsaw Ghetto. And the bridge became the symbol of the ghetto in many visual materials, as well as in the ghetto residents' memories. And I put one quotation of Henryk Makower, who wrote about this bridge experience that you can read. Like walking over the bridge was, for many people, one of very few chances to see, as ghetto people believed, free side of Warsaw, at least more free than the ghetto. And on the right picture, you can see, I hope it's visible for you, artistic installation made by Tomasz Lec and called the Footbridge of the Remembrance. It was unveiled 10 years ago in 2011. And besides, there is since 2008, one of 22 commemorations of the gates and the limits of the ghetto by the project and idea of Tomasz Lec and Eleonora Bergman. And so for us, it's quite often a pretext to start discussion who was in prison in the Warsaw Ghetto and what about the numbers, because of course numbers appear quite often when we discuss such topics as the ghetto, extermination camps, and the war. So from the statistic point of view, there were about at least 400,000 people in prison in Warsaw Ghetto, and it was established in fall of 1940. And that number reached in 1941 to 450,000, but of course, within a year and a half, almost 100,000 people perished because of the disease and the lack of food. But somehow we try to escape this way of discussion about life in the Warsaw Ghetto through the perspective of numbers. And this is why we try to emphasize individual stories. Like in this case, this is the story of Henryk Makower, but quite often many topics we can discuss through the stories that were collected by the Onek Shabbat group or written by the Onek Shabbat group, because then the Warsaw Ghetto and the Holocaust history is not so numbered, but more personal. And when you think about the bridge, the limits and the wall of Warsaw Ghetto, you can think that, you know, for many Jewish Warsawians, establishing a ghetto made a significant part of the city unavailable for them, even though for many of them lived in the city for the whole life. And the walk through the bridge, even a quick one, was for them the only chance to see the city landscape. And the bridge, you know, the bridge somehow was always there on the picture. And even when you see the movies like A Pianist, it has to contain the bridge somewhere there. The bridge itself was dismounted in August 1942, when most of the ghetto residents were deported to the Treblinka extermination camp. And maybe 10, 15 minutes of walk from there, we are next to another building that has survived at Żelazna Street. It's a building, one of 3 buildings at Żelazna 99, 101, and 103, that they were built in 30s and now they are still inhabited. And this address, Żelazna 103, from July 15, 1942, was the command post of Befechtele, where Hermann Heffle and his crew had a headquarters. Heffle was an SS member and the chief of staff of Aktion Reinhardt, and he and his crew were coordinating the deportations of the Warsaw Ghetto residents to Treblinka extermination camp that took place between July 22nd and September 21st, 1942. And there was also a prison inside, in the basement, for Jews who were captured outside the ghetto, and later on they were murdered in the yard behind the building. And during the 2 months of summer 1942, almost 300,000 of Warsaw Ghetto residents died in Treblinka extermination camp, and officially about 35,000 of Jews, mostly young and healthy, were left in the ghetto. And in September 1942, the area of the ghetto was reduced. And what commemorates this history is a small plaque that you can see on the bottom part of the slide. One of many that were originally designed by Karol Tchorek, and they were put in Warsaw streets since 50s. Now there are almost 200 of them. Some of them they are from 50s, but many of them they were put just with this design in 80s or 90s, and they mostly commemorate the victims of the German Nazi murders on the Warsaw inhabitants, not only related to the Holocaust, but also somehow it commemorates many victims of the whole period of German occupation of Warsaw. But what's interesting here that this concrete plaque doesn't commemorate that it was a Befechtele hill. It rather commemorates the victims of the prison that was located here, the prison of Gestapo, even though it wasn't exactly the prison of Gestapo. But it's interesting fact that on many of those plaques, the German crimes were described as they were done by Hitlerites. That became a very, I would say, popular description because since in 1949 the East Germany state was established, the communist propaganda in Poland couldn't use the word German as those who were responsible for murders, because there were also so-called good Germans in the East Germany and bad in the West Germany. So the term of Hitlerites was established then, and in many of those plaques this term is used, but in this concrete, the crimes from the prison. I mean, those who were victims of the prison are described as the victims of Gestapo, which is not very precise. And now part of the houses in those 3 buildings are subsidized housing, which means part of the inhabitants haven't chosen to live in this place, but some other flats are abandoned, but in some of them there are inhabitants, and that's the only one part, the only one plaque and the only one commemoration that somehow reminds the story of this building from the war period. And another building that's doesn't exist anymore, but has quite new commemoration that if some of you haven't been to Warsaw this summer, you may have not seen before because it was established only in April this year. So this is the former Nowolipki 68. Before the war, there was a school named by Dr. Borojov, a former leader of Poale Zion party and the researcher of Yiddish language. And after the war, the new neighborhood Muranov was constructed on the ruins of the ghetto. And so you can see it on the new pictures. And the former address Nowolipki 68 doesn't exist anymore. So it's just a square between the numbers 28 and 30 right now. And this is where the documentation prepared by the Onek Shabbat group was buried and later on discovered. So the Onek Shabbat group, the Emanuel Ringelblum and at least 60 co-workers of him, they were documenting from the fall of 1940, in general, the life of the Jews during the German occupation. And at some point, they changed the priority since the news about mass killings on Jews in the East Front were coming to Warsaw, the news from Ponary or the news from extermination coming in Borojov or Kulmhof were coming to Warsaw. The group changed priorities and they started to document what we know right now, or what we call right now the Holocaust. So the group wanted to document those events and somehow alarm the world. And indeed, some reports were given to the Polish underground, and later on they were given to the Polish authorities in the government on exile in London. But when the deportation to Treblinka started in July 1942, the group members decided to bury the documents they got, and they did that in 10 metal boxes in early August 1942, exactly in this building. And on this monument, you can see a copy of a testament of young guy, David Graber, who helped burying the documents in August 1942. And he was aware that he may not survive until the end of the war, but he wrote, "What we've been unable to shout out to the world, we've buried to the ground." And the first part of the sentence now is a title of the permanent exhibition at the GHI that is devoted to the people who created that collection. This is also where the second part of the documentation was buried a few months later, and most probably in February 1943 in the 2 Milkans. Both parts were found after the war in 1946 and 1950. And we would say this is one of the most precious sources of information regarding the fate of Polish Jews during the war, because it presents the Jewish perspective on the Holocaust. And importance of this collection also is visible when we know that since 90s it's on the UNESCO Memory of the World list. And this commemoration you can see on the new pictures, it was unveiled on April 19, 2021. Before, there was actually nothing that would let us know that this very important collection and this sign of activity of the Onek Shabbat group was buried and discovered here. And both of the teenagers who were responsible for burying the documents, David Graber and Nahum Grzywacz, were students of teacher Israel Lichtenstein, who worked in this school. All of them, they were socialist Zionists, and they believed that the future of the Jewish nation is in the free socialist state of Palestine after the war. And one of those two teenagers, in his testament, because both of them, they added testaments to the collection of documents they buried, he wrote that he believes that this collection is supposed to be somehow exhibit in the Free Jewish Palestine in the museum named by Borojov. But what happened here in Warsaw after the war? As almost the whole former Warsaw Ghetto doesn't exist anymore, there was this question how to commemorate the past. And the architect Bogdan Lachet was responsible for constructing part of Muranów district. He wanted the district itself to be a monument and wanted to construct new buildings without a facade. So the destruction of the former ghetto would be visible even in the architecture. But even back then, just after the war, people didn't want to be reminded of that all the time. But also, lack of facade didn't help with rain and heavy winter, so it didn't work, and all of the buildings got the facade. And these days we have many commemorations and monuments, names, and plaques that let us, the current inhabitants, to get to know what was here in the past. But not all of the commemorations were put in the same moment. There were certain dynamics over years after the war where and why they were put here and there. And this particular one was unveiled only these few moments ago. But here we have a few other, maybe even more famous commemorations. Before the war, this area was the region of Zamenhofa and Gęsia Street. Now we have Polin Museum, 2 monuments, and many commemorations nearby. And so many rubble after the former Jewish ghetto, the Jewish district was destroyed, couldn't be removed. So it was used both as a construction material to build Muranów, and also it was used to build an altitude on which all of the buildings were constructed. So the level above the ground in this part of Warsaw is a few meters higher than elsewhere in the area. And just after the war, there were a few initiatives to commemorate the Polish Jewish community. And the first monument, the small one, in the shape of the manhole to the sewer, was unveiled in 1946. But the big monument that actually these days you can see its replica in the Yad Vashem in Jerusalem. The monument that was called the Monument to the Ghetto Heroes was designed by Nathan Rapoport and unveiled in April 1948. And it commemorated both Jewish fighters and all of the Jewish civilians murdered by the German Nazis. And so actually, both commemorations were unveiled in late 40s, and then it took almost 40 years until the next commemorations were put here. In the late 80s, the route of remembrance of the Jewish martyrdom and struggle was unveiled, the one that starts here by this monument and ends at former Umschlagplatz. Later on, the commemoration of Żegota Council to Aid Jews was unveiled, and one of the most new commemorations, it's the building of Polin Museum itself. And from the one hand, the whole Muranów district was, built on the ruins of the ghetto, but in the same time, it was example of the post-war rebirth of Warsaw after the destruction. But now living there means also as well to deal with the knowledge about the past, that it's still there. And the commemorations let the new residents who moved here just after the war or later on somehow to understand how life was here before the war. And as most of the pre-war buildings doesn't exist anymore, only those commemorations, monuments, street names, or small details in the architecture can commemorate the past. And most of those commemorations are somehow related to the war and the Holocaust. But there are a few exceptions, like the whole Polin Museum is dedicated to the 1,000 years long history of the Polish Jews. But also there is another new commemoration in the street name, that street that commemorates the Rabbi Meisels, the Rabbi of Warsaw from 19th century. And that was former street, part of the street Niska was renamed into the Rabbi Meisel Street upon the initiative of the Jewish Historical Institute. So the Rabbi Meisels Head Street just before the war, just for maybe a bit more than 1 year, and then for many years it vanished. For many years it vanished from the maps of Warsaw until the October 1st, 2021. Former Miła 18. Of course, before the war, there was just the regular building as the buildings look like in this area. But in this story, it's important that at some point during the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, it became also headquarters to the JOB, Jewish Combat Organization leaders. And what's interesting is that it does tell us about the fact that those members of JOB were hidden in the bunker. When the bunker was discovered by the Germans, they decided to commit suicide rather than to be imprisoned. And somehow it brings back the history of the defenders of Masada, the stronghold that's fought with Roman Empire troops, and they also at some point committed suicide. But also it could be, a point to discuss the whole resistance in the Warsaw Ghetto, because for many years, mostly only one organization, Jewish combat organization led by Mordechai Anielewicz, and after the bunker at Miło was discovered, led by Marek Edelman. So mostly the post-war history of this armed resistance in Warsaw Ghetto described only JOB, but nearby, just next to this former bunker, also there's a new commemoration of the Jewish Military Union that after the war, both in Poland and Israel, was somehow marginalized. And the leader of JZW, Paweł Frenkel, is commemorated here. What's interesting that who is also commemorated, maybe it's not very visible on this flag, is David Apfelbaum, that for years he was known as a supposed leader of Jewish Military Union. That's the character probably never existed. In 1988, there were several commemorations in this area that they were unveiled, and all of them they're in this somehow route between the monument to the ghetto heroes and Umschlagplatz. So on the left, you have upper left side, you have one of the most probably famous pictures of Umschlagplatz. Before the war, it was just a place where the railroad tracks were connected to the Warsaw Gdańsk station, and now we have a commemoration of Umschlagplatz, place from where most of the Warsaw Ghetto inhabitants were transferred to Treblinka extermination camp. And on the commemoration that was unveiled only in 1988, we have a wall with 400 various names of Polish Jews that represents, not from the one hand, it represents 400,000 of Warsaw Ghetto victims, but also when you read the names and you see the names that they could be classically Jewish names, you also see that there are many names that you would rather say that they are Polish, and it somehow describes the diversity of that community. And for us, as the Jewish Historical Institute, this place also is very important because since 2012, we organize an event that we call the March of Remembrance. That's always on the 22nd of July. We commemorate the victims of Warsaw Ghetto, that they were deported to Treblinka extermination camp, but we somehow want to organize the event that not ends at Umschlagplatz, but rather starts there and leads to a certain location that commemorates a concrete person or group of people, and that they were important for the Warsaw Ghetto. So we started in 2012 with commemoration of Janusz Korczak. Later on, we commemorated a poet, Władysław Szlengel. Sometimes we commemorate a group of people like Dionek Shabbat or Little Smugglers. And this year, in the 10th edition, we commemorated the teachers of Warsaw Ghetto. I don't want to speak too long, so the last three locations I will try to describe very briefly. So this is one of the very famous and very crowded intersections in the pre-war Jewish Warsaw, Gęsie and Nalewki intersection that completely doesn't exist anymore. And in the face of destruction of the former northern district, the pre-war topography became no longer relevant, and the post-war streets became often straightened. Sometimes the names were changed, and this is why walking here with the old map and looking for the old address isn't effective. And the post-war streets names changes had their symbolic meaning. A new name meant to commemorate individuals or some events related to the wartime. For example, former Gęsia Goose Street, which connected the Jewish cemetery at Okopowa with Nalewki, was very famous because of the Gęsia Yiddish dialect. And after the war, it was straightened and renamed to commemorate Mordechai Anielewicz, the leader of Job. And from the other hand, Nalewki Street, only 200 meters of the pre-war street survived, and this part was outside the ghetto, even though in 1947 it was renamed into the Ghetto Hero Streets. And nearby there is a completely new street that got the name of Nalewki, that even though it was never located where the old Nalewki was. And in 2019, the former Ghetto Hero Street was renamed again to be called Stare Nalewki, which means old Nalewki. And Krasiński Garden and the Ghetto Wall Memorial, it's also very important locations because this is where the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising started. So, but this is also where we can see more or less at least a part of the pre-war street, because we have this 200 meters long former Nalewki Street and entrance to the Krasiński Garden. So this commemoration is on the former intersection of Nalewki and Świętojerska, and this is where some of the German troops entered the ghetto on April 1943, and this is the moment when these troops met the armed resistance and what we call the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. And out of 50,000-60,000 of people who were officially and unofficially in the Warsaw Ghetto, only a few hundreds had a chance to fight with Germans, both from Job and ZZW. And it was never like a regular conflict with like official end of conflict. So for us, the symbolic end of Warsaw Ghetto Uprising and also symbolic end of Jewish Warsaw would be May 16, the day when the great synagogue of Tłumackie was destroyed. And the last part is former Nalewki. For many people before the war, Nalewki was a symbol of the pre-war Jewish Warsaw and the pre-war Warsaw Jewish district. And this emptiness that we can see on this former street, this is what we can see right now. And on the bottom left side, you can see again 1947, the same part of former Nalewki with destroyed Krasiński Garden on the right and the pile of ruins elsewhere. And this is one of the locations that we at the GHI attempted a few times to fill in that void with initiatives that bring back the remembrance of the former Jewish districts and its inhabitants. And like on the one side, you can see a temporary exhibition that we opened in 2017, Nalewki Stories from a Non-Existent Street. And a year later, based on that exhibition, we published a Polish and English language book devoted to the history of that street. And somehow through the history of Nalewki, we can more or less describe the history of Jewish Warsaw in general. And this year, on the right side, you can see a temporary construction that's called Benches, that is designed by the architect of Jakub Szczęsny with collaboration of the GHI. So that was the destination for the participants of the March of Remembrance this year, and it brought back the remembrance of the Warsaw teachers who lived and worked inside and outside the Warsaw Ghetto. And what is interesting, after a couple of weeks, this installation was dismounted and more than 40 benches were handed out to the schools and culture institutions. And nearby, what is very interesting, there are also commemorations of the few other events or related to few other stories that are important for the Polish history, but not necessarily with the Polish Jewish history. For example, on the bottom left side, you can see the commemoration of Polish soldiers who fought among the Allied armies in the Battle of Monte Cassino during the World War II. Next to it, there's a square that would commemorate the political prisoners of the Stalinism. And there's also another one that would commemorate the żołnierze tułacze, the soldiers, the wanderers, that would commemorate those Polish soldiers who participate in many battles among the Allied armies in the war theater of the World War II. So not everywhere, but sometimes there's this thing that, you know, there are so many stories related to the history of Warsaw or history of Poland, especially the history of the World War II and the post-war period, that sometimes on every single corner you have some commemorations, and this is what you can find also in some areas of former Warsaw ghetto. But I think and I believe that in those locations that I have mentioned, not only you can somehow read the direct history of this particular place, but you can somehow find a bit deeper, a kind of deeper meaning of some aspect of the history of the Warsaw and the Polish Jews. That you know, this particular location or commemoration could be just, you know, point to start the discussion about something a bit deeper that I maybe couldn't do in 45 or 50 minutes. But thank you for your patience. Now I'll be happy to maybe listen to your comments or answer your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Okay, let's look at the questions. There are quite a few. Did Marconi design the Zich building? You know? No.
I mean, it was, you know, he didn't live anymore in that moment, because the Zich building is definitely built in that style, but the whole construction was built in the years of 1928, 1936, so way later than the other buildings in the area. So it was just this this style rather.
Let's see, question for discussion. I want to ask if via topography of Warsaw, where we can learn also about the history of the first Jewish settlements in Warsaw and other places in Poland.
Yeah, I would say that again, like quite often, we can use some location to start discussion about what we cannot see anymore, because that's the thing, that we don't have many sources about the earliest history of the Warsaw Jews, but the best source is probably the PhD thesis of Emanuel Ringelblum, because Emanuel Ringelblum used the documents in the archive in 20s, that those documents doesn't exist anymore. They were somehow gone or destroyed during the war. And Ringelblum described that the first Jewish settlements were probably in the 14th century, but the documents confirmed that they already existed in the 15th century, and they were there was a part of the old town of Warsaw with the Jewish street that doesn't exist anymore, that the most of this population lived. That was about 120 people in the 15th century. And now this former Jewish street doesn't exist, but there is, next to the wall near the old town in Warsaw, there is a rycerska, like Knights Street. And this is more or less located where the former Jewish street was. So then again, there's nothing that would commemorate this earliest history of the Warsaw Jews. But, you know, sometimes the fact that something doesn't exist or doesn't exist anymore could be a reason why you start the discussion. Where was it and why it doesn't exist anymore? 2 years ago, we published, it was the last year, we published at the GHI the book, which was called Warszawa, about the history, the Jewish history of Warsaw from the beginning until the 21st century. But we have to say that this earliest history is based mostly on the rather books, not really sources, like books like Emanuel Ringelblum thesis. So I would say that you cannot find too much in the landscape, especially because of the fact that it's you know, the old town of Warsaw was destroyed during Warsaw Uprising and later on, which means nowadays is a post-war rebuild of former old town. So it's not only the pre-war old town of Warsaw where already this Jewish street doesn't exist. So it is like there are so many layers under the ground that you could somehow dig in and try to find some stories. So this Jewish layer in the old town, it is there, but very, very deep, and you have to, you know a history at least a little bit to know where to look.
Okay, thank you, Shmuley Yerushalmi, for the interesting question. Another question, why there is no initiative to change the stone that commemorates Applebaum?
To be honest, I have no idea. I mean, maybe because, I mean, it is like my idea that I guess, but I don't know, because maybe because it commemorates also Pavel Frenkel, and I don't know who's responsible for erecting this stone. So it's always a problem if you have to remove some of the old commemoration that is somewhere and it's partly true, and you know, it's not like completely lie. Even though there's another interesting story that there's a square that commemorates Apfelbaum, that it still exists there, and you know, I guess it's just a matter of bureaucracy, and I hope it will maybe commemorate some real character one day.
Okay, Michael Trayson have two questions about Femina. How is it that Femina survived, and who owned it before September 1939?
To be honest, I don't know who owned this before September 39. I don't remember who was the owner of the building. I'm not sure if it was the Jewish owner or not. But quite often, some buildings survived by the accident, and some buildings they survived partly, and they were simply not rebuilt after the war, or they were not rebuilt in purpose because of the construction of the new street. So I'm not sure about Femina, but there is another building that when you see the pile of ruins, and there's always this church visible. You have pile of ruins over of the former Warsaw ghetto, and you have a church at Nowolipki Street. So, for example, this particular church survived because it became a storehouse for the Germans that they used to keep many goods that they found they wanted to use somehow after the ghetto was destroyed. But in case of Femina and the other locations of the former ghetto that they are on the southern part of Leszno Street, they had a bit different history, because as the ghetto size became smaller after the deportation to Treblinka, the building where Femina was located became a part of so-called Aryan site. So it was not destroyed during the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. Warsaw Ghetto Uprising took place only in so-called the rest ghetto, between streets like Stawki, where the Umschlagplatz is, and Leszno, and Fyodor Street that somehow surrounded this area. So this is why the building was not destroyed during Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, but most of the buildings that somehow survived that moment, they were destroyed during Warsaw Uprising 1 year later. So this building was somehow lucky, apparently.
Is there a map with the location you presented here?
Yeah, I will send the link. Actually, I'm keeping it, so just give me a second.
You can put it on the chat.
Yeah. So I'm having it. I just made it for that presentation, but that would be maybe more convenient to you. We can click. Okay, it's there.
Great, thank you. And is there an initiative to create a new and more convenient place to guide and educate about the ghetto wall?
Sorry. Which question is that?
The last one from Ron. I think he means that now it's quite problematic to guide next to the wall, the ghetto wall in Zbota. So
Okay.
is there some plan to have, you know, to make
to be
a
honest,
place?
I have no idea. Maybe as you know, there will be a Warsaw Ghetto, a museum of the Warsaw Ghetto that is now being constructed, and their permanent exhibition is being on the way to be. So maybe somehow that would fit to their activities. But so far, I don't know anything about that. If it's like a private area, I don't know. I mean, it's always somehow complicated, and probably there are some reasons why it's not easily accessible until now. So I'm worried that I cannot give you any concrete answer or hope that it will be more available.
Okay, maybe I'll take it to, there is a questions regarding it's very connected to the Polish memory. Are there any signs or tablicy commemorating the Blue Police or the Order Service or the child smugglers, the headquarters of the Judenrat?
As far as I know, they are not. I mean, the child smugglers were somehow commemorated by us as the GHI, because one March of Remembrance was devoted a few years ago to the child smugglers. But recently there is a new commemoration. I don't know if they are like smugglers, but the sellers of the cigarettes on the area outside of the ghetto. They were commemorated. If you give me a second, I will give you the link to what I, because there is this new. Okay, because this is something new that took place in October. So we have on the 10th of October this year, there were cigarette and there were Jewish kids that escaped the ghetto, and they were selling cigarettes and the newspapers to earn the money and survive. So this is not exactly, I guess, what you are asking about the smugglers, but this group was commemorated. So I'm sending a link. This is in Polish, but more or less, maybe you would find some informations in English as well. If it's about the Jewish police, one of our employees of scientific department, Dr. Katarzyna Persson, she published the book about probably the best monography about the Jewish police, and that was published in English this year.
Yeah, Policjanci.
So I can give you maybe the link to the English version to those, because it was published by the Cornell, I guess, University this year. So I'm also sending the link to those who are interested. I don't know, maybe they have or something.
I will mention also that in our YouTube channel, you can find the discussion with Katarzyna Persson from last year. She was the first meeting in this Syria. And maybe one last question, because we are run out of time. And back to beginning, what elements of the Great Synagogue were saved, and by whom, and where are they? If
you know, there's this thing when you see the picture of the ruins of the synagogue, it was like the explosives were put in the way that the synagogue somehow collapsed to the inside. So you see the menorahs in front of the synagogue and all of the ruins. But you know, when the war was over, there was one picture that's I presented you, that there was this kind of march in 1947 that you've seen only the huge pile of ruins. So as far as I know, there is, I don't know, but if it's in our collection, the key to the locker room from the synagogue. And I don't know if there are any other elements of the synagogue, because you know there was this thing that the synagogue was destroyed on May 16, 1943, and let's say the German occupation ended more than a year and a half later. So there was thousands of hundreds of days when this, let's say, goods from the synagogues could be could be stolen, destroyed, or taken somewhere. So the thing is that most probably not all of the equipment of the synagogue was still there when it was destroyed, because there was this thing that when the war started, many synagogues were plundered, and the most, let's say, precious or preciously looking elements, they were stolen by Germans, and they were kept most probably in some private hands or some storehouses. And for example, from this particular synagogue, I'm not sure if there's something else in this or that collection, but also at the GHI, we have a small exhibition that we call the Small Synagogue of Tłumackie. That's an Orthodox synagogue that we equipped with various elements from different synagogues. That those elements we found in the German storehouses because they were plundered from here and there. So maybe it's somewhere in some collections, but as far as I don't know if there's anything else except the key to the locker room in the synagogue. Maybe there are some small elements, but we are not sure if we can recognize that it was from this concrete synagogue.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we need to finish, but thank you very much for for the presentation and answering all those questions. Quite many. We didn't made to answer all the questions, but of course it's possible to make a connection with the GHI to write emails. So if there are questions that we couldn't answer, so please have a connection. So thank you all for taking part on this first event of our second series. I would like to thank again to Dr. Bartosz Borys and to the Emanuel Ringelblum Jewish Historical Institute, and especially Aga Kargol and Monica Kravchik, to Yulia Matskevich and Katarzyna Dziejawska, from the Polish Institute in Tel Aviv, to Gil Faran and the Association of Israel Guides and Leaders of Delegations to Poland and Commemoration of the Holocaust, and to Moreshet Mordechai Anielewicz Memorial Education and Research Center. Our next event will take place on the 22nd of November at 7 o'clock. We'll publish an invitation for this, and thank you very much, and keep safe.
Thank you very much. Appreciate your time. Have a good evening and see you later.
Thank you.